Philosophy has a habit of domesticating its most difficult thinkers. Hegel is the most domesticated of all, reduced to a ternary formula that he never used, assigned positions he explicitly rejected, and treated as a historical curiosity rather than a living problem. The reduction is convenient because the real Hegel poses a genuine threat to how most of us think about thinking. He is not arguing that thought is messy, or that contradictions are useful metaphors, or that history has a rhythm. He is arguing that the very structure of rationality is self-undermining in a way that produces necessarily and not accidentally the categories through which reality becomes intelligible. That is a claim with teeth, and it is not going away. This series reconstructs the Hegelian system from its foundations, not from its reputation. The architecture matters here because Hegel's individual claims cannot be evaluated in isolation. A claim about contradiction in the logic cannot be properly assessed without understanding what Hegel means by logic and why it begins where it does. The lordship and bondage dialectic cannot be understood without the account of recognition that precedes it. The political philosophy cannot be evaluated without the ontological commitments of the doctrine of concept that underpin it. Each part of this series completes something that the previous part left deliberately open. The focus throughout is the current state of the debate. Several developments since the early 1990s have genuinely changed the landscape. Robert Pippin's non-metaphysical reading, Robert Brandam's inferentialist reconstruction, Dieter Henrich's Reflection-Theoretic critique, and the ongoing dispute about whether Hegel's logical contradictions constitute a form of dialetheism. Where the debate is unsettled, that will be said clearly. Where a standard interpretation has been decisively challenged, the challenge gets its full hearing. Where Hegel may simply be wrong, that possibility will be faced rather than managed. Part 1. The Kant Inheritance. Why Hegel cannot start anywhere else. Kant's first critique establishes something precise and disturbing. The categories through which we structure experience, categories like causality, substance and unity, are contributions of the subject, not features read off from the world. They are the conditions under which experience is possible for a mind like ours. This means that what we can know is confined to phenomena, the world as it appears under these conditions, while things as they are in themselves, the noumena, or things in themselves, remain permanently inaccessible. We can describe the structure of our experience with precision, but we cannot get behind it. The thing in itself is real for Kant, but it is epistemically walled off. This looks like a sober, modest result. It tells us where knowledge ends and speculation begins. For a generation of philosophers after Kant, however, this modesty concealed a structural instability that Kant had not addressed. The problem begins with the concept of the thing in itself. To say there is a thing in itself that affects us, that causes our sensory manifold, is already to apply the category of causality to something that lies outside the domain where causality is supposed to apply. Kant uses the concept of affection, of the noumenal world acting on us, precisely where his own system forbids its use. Hegel's entry point into this problem is not to deny that Kant noticed something real about the subject's contribution to experience. The critical move is to show that the thing in itself, as a concept, is incoherent from within Kant's own framework. If the thing in itself is unknowable, then we cannot say it exists, that it affects us, or that it is the ground of appearances. These are all determinate claims about something Kant declared indeterminate. As Hegel puts it in the opening of the Encyclopaedia Logic, what is called the thing in itself is precisely the abstraction from all the determinations of actuality, which is itself a perfectly determinate result. The unknowable has been given a great deal of content by the act of calling it unknowable. But Hegel's deeper critique concerns the methodology of critique itself. Kant proposed that before philosophy investigates the world, it should investigate the cognitive instrument it will use, the faculty of reason and understanding. The idea is that you should examine your tools before you start building. Hegel's objection, sharpened most clearly in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, is that this approach is self-defeating. To examine the faculty of cognition, you must use cognition. To assess the limits of reason, you must use reason. The examination cannot stand outside of what it examines. Trying to know knowledge before you know anything is, as Hegel's analogy has it, like refusing to enter the water until you have learned to swim. This is not a rhetorical point. It has precise structural implications. Kant's critical philosophy assumes that the distinction between how things appear to us and how they are in themselves is a stable starting point that critique can use without investigating. Hegel denies that this distinction can be taken as foundational. The subject-object split, the very form of the opposition between knowing subject and known world, is itself a product of a particular shape of thought, not a transcendental given. It has a history, and it will be overcome. The precise premise where Hegel and Kant diverge is this. Kant holds that the form of cognition and the content to which it applies come from different sources. The subject supplies the forms, the thing in itself supplies the material. Hegel holds that this dualism is unstable because the act of distinguishing subject from object is already a conceptual act that neither side of the distinction can explain on its own. The concept of the thing in itself is a concept, which means it is already on the side of thought, not outside it. The boundary Kant draws is drawn by the very faculty whose scope is supposed to be limited by the boundary. What Hegel takes from Kant, and does not abandon, is the idea that philosophy must be critical. The pre-Kantian rationalists, Leibniz and Wolff most prominently, simply assumed that reason could directly cognize the structure of reality without first asking what entitles reason to do this. Kant was right that this assumption needs examination, but Kant's examination stopped at a fixed dualism of subject and world, a dualism that is itself in need of examination. Hegel's project is to push the critique further, past the point where Kant stopped. The result will not be a return to pre-critical dogmatism, but it will require abandoning the thing in itself and the permanent subject-object split that comes with it. This leaves Hegel with a precise and urgent problem. If philosophy cannot begin from a given subject examining a given world, and if there is no pre-philosophical vantage point from which to examine our cognitive tools, where does philosophy begin, and how does it begin without simply presupposing what it needs to demonstrate? Part 2. The Thesis-Antithesis-Synthesis myth and what the dialectic actually is. Most educated people believe Hegel's method operates through a triadic sequence. A thesis is posed, its antithesis is generated, and the two are reconciled in a synthesis. This formula is almost entirely wrong as a description of Hegel's procedure. Hegel never used the words thesis, antithesis, and synthesis as a systematic schema in any of his major texts. The formula derives primarily from Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who did employ something like it, and from popularizers who found the ternary structure a convenient shorthand. The historian Gustav Müller documented this in a careful 1958 study, and it has been confirmed repeatedly in scholarship since. The mislabeling matters because it fundamentally misrepresents what drives Hegelian transitions. The thesis-antithesis-synthesis picture implies that a position is stated, its external opposite is assembled against it, and a mediating third term bridges them. The movement looks like debate, claim and counterclaim, followed by resolution. This is not Hegel's account. For Hegel, the transitions are driven not by an external opposite being introduced from outside, but by the internal instability of the concept itself. A concept breaks down because of what it is, not because something from the outside challenges it. The negation is intrinsic, not imported. What Hegel actually describes in the Encyclopedia Logic sections 79 through 82 is 3 moments or sides of every logical determination. The first moment is the moment of the understanding, Verstand in German, where a concept is grasped as having a fixed, stable definition with clear boundaries. A thing is what it is, and not what it is not. The understanding is the faculty of determination, of holding concepts apart and specifying their content precisely. It is the mode of thought that makes science, mathematics, and ordinary practical reasoning possible. Hegel does not dismiss it. The second moment is the dialectical moment, also called the negatively rational. Here, the one-sidedness or restrictedness in the concept's fixed definition comes to the surface. The concept's own determination carries within it a tension that destabilizes it. The crucial feature is that this is self-sublation, as Hegel calls it, the concept's own nature driving it to pass into its opposite. No external force is required. The concept undermines itself. The third moment is the speculative or positively rational. This is where Hegel parts decisively from the standard logical tradition. In classical logic, if a set of premises generates a contradiction, the correct response is to reject the premises and conclude nothing positive. The contradiction is a reductio ad absurdum, a dead end that refutes the starting point. For Hegel, this response misses what is most important. The contradiction that emerges from the dialectical moment is not a dead end, but a determinate result. It is a specific, content-laden outcome that carries the trace of the concepts that produced it. The speculative moment grasps this positive content in the collapse. A concrete scenario makes this structural point visible. Consider the concept of a limit as it functions in mathematics and in ordinary thought. The understanding fixes the concept of a limit as a boundary. What is inside and what is outside are clearly distinguished. But when you push the concept of a limit, you find that the limit is defined by what it separates, that it both belongs to what is inside and to what is outside, and that the attempt to specify it precisely generates an instability in the very boundary you tried to fix. The concept of a limit passes into the concept of transition, And the concept of transition is not simply the negation of limit, but a new determination that carries both inside and outside as moments within it. This is the speculative result, not the rejection of limits, but a richer concept that includes limiting and transitioning as aspects of a single process. The practically important implication is that Hegelian dialectic has no fixed schematic form. The number of moments in any particular dialectical sequence varies with the subject matter. Some transitions involve more than 3 steps, some fewer, and the pattern depends on the internal structure of the concept being examined. The 3 moments, understanding, dialectical, speculative, describe aspects of what happens in every dialectical transition, not the number of terms involved in each one. Anyone who applies the Thesis-Antithesis-Synthesis grid to Hegel's texts will find it fits some passages tolerably well and many others not at all, and will be confused by both. What remains genuinely difficult, even after correcting the formula, is Hegel's claim that this self-sublating movement is necessary rather than contingent. Why should a concept's own determination drive it to pass into its opposite? This is not obvious, and the answer depends on exactly what work the word contradiction is doing in Hegel's logic. That question requires its own full treatment, and it has a live debate in contemporary scholarship that is far from closed. Part 3. Being nothing. Becoming. What the first 3 pages of the logic are actually doing. The science of logic opens with a problem that is not immediately visible as a problem. If Hegel's logic is to be a science of pure thought, a derivation of the most fundamental categories of rational thought without any presuppositions, it must begin somewhere. But every beginning already presupposes something. A subject matter, a method, a reason for starting here rather than there. Any content you bring to the starting point imports assumptions that have not yet been justified. The logic cannot begin with a sophisticated concept like substance, cause or mind, because those concepts would need to be derived from something more basic. But it cannot begin with nothing at all, because then it has no starting point. Hegel's solution is to begin with what is left when you subtract every determination from a concept, pure being, sign, with no further qualification. Not the being of this or that thing, not existence in any specific sense, but being as such, stripped of every particular content. This is the most minimal starting point conceivable, the thought of something in general before anything specific is thought about it. Its philosophical advantage is precisely that it imports nothing. Now examine what pure being actually is, considered as a concept. It has no determination, no specific content, no distinguishing feature. It is pure indeterminacy. But pure indeterminacy is also what we mean by nothing, nichts. Both concepts, when actually thought rather than merely gestured at, have the same content, complete absence of determination. The difference is only one of intention. Being is meant as presence, nothing as absence. But when the concepts are examined rather than merely pointed at, this difference in intention collapses into the same indeterminate content. Here is where most introductory treatments stop and declare the result puzzling or mystical. The actually important move is what Hegel does next. Being and nothing are not identical, even though they have the same content. They are meant differently, pointed at differently. This means there is a movement, a restless instability between them. Being slides into nothing, nothing into being, and this movement back and forth is itself a concept. Becoming, Werden. Becoming is the first concrete concept in the logic. Unlike being and nothing, which have no internal differentiation and no determinate content, becoming is defined by the relationship between being and nothing. It is the thought of something going from presence to absence, or from absence to presence. Its content is not empty. It is constituted by the tension between the two earlier concepts. Becoming succeeds in being determinate because it inherits the determinations, such as they are, of what came before it. What makes this philosophically significant beyond the logic itself is that the opening moves demonstrate Hegel's general strategy for presuppositionless beginning. The logic does not begin from a neutral vantage point and then add content from outside. It begins with the most minimal possible starting point and allows the internal instability of that starting point to generate the next concept. The progression is driven from within. Every later concept in the logic will have richer content than its predecessors because it will have absorbed the contradictions that the earlier concepts could not resolve. There is a standard objection from Stephen Houlgate and others in the metaphysical reading camp. The opening of the logic requires that we approach it having already undergone the experience the Phenomenology of spirit describes, namely the recognition that all determinate presuppositions have been set aside. The logic's presuppositionlessness is not absolute. It rests on a prior philosophical preparation. Pippin's non-metaphysical reading contests this. For Pippin, the logic's opening is a response to the Kantian problem of how conceptual self-knowledge is possible, not a derivation of being from an emptied standpoint. These two framings of what the logic is actually doing remain in live dispute. The dispute is not merely exegetical. It changes what the logic is supposed to be proving and what would count as a successful objection to it. Part 4. Aufhebung, the one concept doing all the structural work. Every dialectical transition in Hegel depends on a single structural operation that German provides with one word and English cannot. Aufheben, the verb, and Aufhebung, the noun, carry three meanings simultaneously: to cancel or negate, to preserve or retain, and to elevate to a higher level. Hegel is explicit that he intends all three. The English word sublation, which translators use as a technical term for Aufhebung, captures none of these meanings on its own. The triple meaning is not a word game. It names the structural fact that in Hegel's dialectic, what gets negated in a transition is not simply discarded. Consider what happens in ordinary logical negation. If you have the concept of a straight line and negate it, you get not a straight line, which could be a curved line, a broken line, or no line at all. The negation is abstract. It tells you what the concept is not, but nothing about what replaces it. The original concept does not contribute any specific content to what comes after it. The replacement could be anything. This is what Hegel calls abstract negation, and it is logically useless for his purposes. Aufhebung is structurally different. When a concept is sublated, the higher concept that results retains the earlier concept as a moment, a non-independent aspect that continues to do work within the new determination. Consider colour as a concept. When you think the concept red, you are thinking something that gets aufgehoben into the concept color. Color does not simply replace or negate red. Red continues to operate within color as one of its determinate instances. Color is what it is, partly because it is the concept under which red, blue, yellow, and so on are gathered. Without the specificity of the sublated concepts, the higher concept would be empty. Now move this from the relatively ordinary case to the harder one. In the logic's opening, being and nothing are aufgehoben in becoming. Becoming does not simply replace them. Becoming is the movement from being to nothing and from nothing to being, held as a unity. Being and nothing continue to operate within becoming as the poles of the movement that constitutes it. Remove them, and becoming has no content. The structural consequence is that the logic is cumulative in a specific way. Each new concept does not replace what came before it. It contains the earlier concepts as sublated moments. This means the entire logic is present, in compressed form, in any sufficiently late concept. The concept of the absolute idea at the logic's end contains the whole movement of the logic within it. This is also why Hegel says the logic is a circle. The ending returns to the beginning, but with the beginning now understood as the result of the whole. The standard objection to Aufhebung is that the claim to simultaneously cancel and preserve is either incoherent or trivially true. It is incoherent, the objection runs, because cancelling and preserving are contradictory operations. You cannot do both to the same thing in the same respect. Or it is trivially true in the sense that every replacement of a concept by a new one involves the old concept being preserved in memory, which is philosophically uninteresting. Hegel's defenders respond that Aufhebung is neither of these. The earlier concept is preserved not in memory, but as a structurally necessary moment in the higher concept's own definition. The higher concept requires the earlier concept to be what it is. This is a substantive claim, and it can be evaluated case by case as the logic proceeds. Whether it is sustained throughout the logic's massive scope is one of the most contested questions in the literature. Part 5. Verstand and Vernunft, the distinction that makes dialectic possible. There is a widespread assumption that the dialectic between understanding and reason in Hegel is a soft or rhetorical contrast, something like the difference between analytical precision and synthetic insight. This underestimates how technically loaded both concepts are and how much work the distinction does in the system. Understanding and reason, Verstand and Vernunft, are not simply different intellectual styles. They are different modes in which thought relates to its own determinations, and the transition between them is what dialectical movement is. For Kant, understanding is the faculty of concepts, the cognitive capacity that brings the manifold of intuition under rules and produces judgments about objects. Reason, in Kant's sense, is the faculty that seeks the unconditioned, that tries to go beyond all the conditioned items of possible experience to reach a final, unrestricted ground. Reason systematizes and extends the work of understanding, but when it tries to apply its ideas directly to reality, it generates the paralogisms, antinomies, and ideal of pure reason, illusions that look like knowledge but are not. For Kant, reason's overreach produces dialectical illusion, and the proper job of critical philosophy is to expose this and constrain reason within legitimate bounds. Hegel takes both concepts and assigns them different roles, significantly transforming what each does. Understanding in Hegel's sense is the moment of fixity and determination. Thought grasping a concept with clear boundaries, holding it steady, treating its distinctions as real and its content as stable. Understanding is the mode of thought operative in mathematics, in natural science, in law, and in all practical reasoning where precision matters. It produces knowledge that is determinate and reliable within its domain. Hegel does not want to eliminate it. The error of understanding is not that it determines concepts, but that it treats its determinations as final, as if the fixed boundaries were the ultimate truth of the matter. Reason, in Hegel's sense, is the cognitive capacity that grasps what understanding cannot, the positive content in the collapse of understanding's own determinations. The crucial inversion of Kant is here. Kant said reason produces contradictions when it overreaches, and these contradictions prove reason cannot know the unconditioned. Hegel says reason produces contradictions, yes, but the contradictions are not failures. They are invitations. They are the points at which understanding's rigid boundaries break down under their own internal pressure, and reason's task is to grasp what is positive in that breakdown. There is a concrete case that shows this most clearly. Take the concept of a material thing. Understanding determines a material thing as something that occupies space, has determinate properties, and is distinguished from other things by its specific characteristics. This is coherent and useful for physics and ordinary experience. But when you follow the concept of a material thing rigorously, you reach an instability. A material thing is supposed to be self-identical and distinct from other things, but it can only be what it is through its relations to other things. Its properties are relational. It is hard and heavy only relative to other materials. It is extended only relative to what it is not. The concept of a discrete, self-sufficient material thing destabilizes itself when thought through completely. Understanding has nothing to do with this except to note the tension. Reason, in Hegel's sense, grasps the relational structure that understanding tried to exclude. The thing is not dissolved into its relations, but the concept of a discrete, self-sufficient thing is replaced by a richer concept in which internal constitution and external relation are moments of a unified determination. This is not mysticism. It is the recognition that understanding's initial clean boundary was achieved by suppressing a complexity that the concept itself contains. The problem that remains unresolved in this picture is whether Hegel's Vernunft is simply a more sophisticated form of understanding, or whether it is genuinely different in kind. Pippin argues in his reconstruction of the logic that Hegel's reason is still thoroughly discursive, still operating through judgment and inference. There is no mystical intuition of totality, only a more self-aware form of conceptual activity. Critics like Robert Stern argue that Pippin's Hegel is too Kantian, that the speculative moment of reason in Hegel requires a stronger claim about thought's access to reality than Pippin will allow. The precise scope of speculative reason, what it can know and how it knows it, is exactly where the most consequential interpretive disagreements in current Hegel scholarship are located. Part 6. The speculative proposition, why Hegel's sentences are meant to function differently. Open any page of Hegel's mature writing, and you will encounter sentences that resist the reading strategy that works for almost every other philosopher. This is not accidental obscurity or poor writing. Hegel argues in the preface to the Phenomenology that philosophical content requires a form of sentence that ordinary propositional logic cannot accommodate, and he is explicit about why. Understanding this is a precondition for reading Hegel, rather than projecting onto him. The ordinary or representational proposition, which Hegel calls the Satz, has a fixed structure. There is a subject term, which picks out some entity or kind, and there is a predicate, which says something about it. The subject is the stable ground. The predicate qualifies it. The dog is brown leaves the dog standing as a discrete item and adds a property to it. The subject does not change through the predication. It merely acquires an additional determination. Now consider what happens in a sentence like, "The actual is the rational." In ordinary propositional logic, this looks like a claim that actuality and rationality have the same extension, or that everything actual has the property of being rational. The subject, the actual, remains the fixed reference point, and the predicate assigns it a property. But this reading loses what Hegel is doing. When Hegel writes, "The actual is the rational," the subject term actual does not remain stable while rational is predicated of it. The thought that the actual is the rational requires us to understand actuality itself through rationality and rationality through actuality, so that neither term remains what it was at the start of the sentence. Hegel calls this the speculative proposition. In a speculative proposition, the predicate does not merely qualify the subject, but transforms the subject's own determination. Thought, in reading the sentence, is pushed back from the predicate into the subject, and finds the subject altered by what was predicated of it. Hegel describes this as a counterthrust, in which the sentence's movement reflects back on itself. This is not merely semantic complexity. It is an argument about what kind of logical form is adequate to speculative content. The practical consequence for reading Hegel is substantial. When you read "Spirit is the idea that has returned to itself," you cannot pass this by identifying a subject called spirit and asking what is asserted of it as an external property. The sentence is a node in a network of determinations in which every term modifies every other term. The meaning is distributed across the network, not located in the subject term. Reading Hegel requires following this movement rather than extracting discrete claims. Resistance to this is not philosophical sophistication. It is the understanding's refusal to leave its own mode. The most forceful contemporary challenge to the speculative proposition doctrine comes from those who argue that it simply makes Hegelian sentences unfalsifiable. If any apparent contradiction in a speculative claim can be resolved by saying that the subject was modified by the predicate in the course of the sentence's movement, then no Hegelian speculative proposition is ever in danger from a counterexample. Sebastian Rödel and Michael Wolff have pressed versions of this objection. Hegel's defenders respond that the speculative proposition does not eliminate truth conditions, but changes the unit at which truth is assessed, from the individual sentence to the whole articulated network of determinations. Whether this response is satisfactory or is a sophisticated evasion is a genuine open question. Part 7. Determinate negation and why abstract negation gets you nothing. The philosophical tradition before Hegel uses negation to clear the ground. You find a concept that fails some test, you reject it, and you look for something better. The rejection might be powered by a counterexample, a contradiction in the concept itself, or a rival theory that does the same work more elegantly. In all these cases, negation removes the concept from the field and leaves you with a blank that must be filled from outside. This is what Hegel calls abstract negation, and his objection to it is structural rather than merely aesthetic. Abstract negation tells you what is not the case, but it cannot tell you what is the case, because the negative result carries no information about its own replacement. Any number of different positions could fill the blank left by the rejected concept. Philosophical progress driven by abstract negation alone will be episodic and arbitrary. You stumble upon the next position not because the rejected one demanded it, but because you happen to think of it. Determinate negation, bestimmte Negation in German, is structurally different in a way that makes it the engine of dialectical progress. In determinate negation, the specific character of the concept's failure generates the specific content of what replaces it. The negation is not of the concept in general, but of a specific inadequacy in the concept, and that inadequacy points to what must be included in any successor concept. The result is not a blank, but a new determination with identifiable content. Take the transition in the Phenomenology from sense certainty to perception. Sense certainty is the claim that the most immediate, most direct form of knowledge is also the richest. This thing, here now, known without mediation. When Hegel examines what sense certainty actually delivers, he finds that this, here and now, are universal terms, not singular references. Now applies to every moment. Here applies to any location. The supposed singular immediacy turns out to involve universals all the way down. The specific inadequacy of sense certainty is that it claimed to be purely singular and immediate, but required universality and mediation to articulate its very object. This specific failure determines the content of what must come next. The successor concept cannot simply ignore universality. It must account for how the universal and the particular are related in any cognitive grasp of an individual thing. This is perception, the concept of an object as a thing with multiple properties, universal and particular aspects held together. Perception is not an arbitrary next stop. It is what sense certainty's specific internal failure demands. The determinate character of the negation carries the dialectic forward. This is where the notion of determinacy meets the most serious technical challenge. The claim that each dialectical transition is driven by the specific character of the preceding concept's failure seems to require that there is only one possible successor to each concept. Critics, most sharply Michael Rosen in his study of Hegel's Dialectic from 1982, argue that Hegel has not shown this uniqueness. Even if the failure of sense certainty demands a concept that accommodates universality, there are many different concepts that do this. And Hegel has not demonstrated that perception specifically is the uniquely required next step. The transitions may be motivated, but not strictly necessary. Hegel's system is vulnerable here, and the question of whether determinate negation produces genuine necessity or only strong motivation is genuinely unresolved. Part 8. The Phenomenology's Method. Immanent Critique from the Inside. The Phenomenology of Spirit is not a history of philosophy, not a psychological account of human development, and not a survey of cultural formations. It is a specific methodological project. The demonstration that every form of consciousness, examined according to its own internal standards, generates the conditions for its own supersession. The method is immanent critique, and what makes it immanent is exactly what makes it philosophically distinctive. Hegel does not evaluate a shape of consciousness from an external standpoint that the consciousness itself has not accepted. Every shape of consciousness that the phenomenology examines comes with an implicit claim about what counts as knowledge, what the object of knowledge is, and what the criterion of success is. Sense certainty claims that direct acquaintance with the particular is the model of knowledge. The object is the immediate given. The criterion is the richness of direct contact. Hegel does not reject this by importing a better criterion from outside. He shows that when sense certainty is evaluated against its own criterion, it fails. The immediate particular it claims to know is, when actually examined, already universal and mediated. The failure is internal, not external. The technical structure of immanent critique in the phenomenology involves two perspectives that are in play simultaneously. There is the perspective of natural consciousness, the shape of consciousness being examined, which takes its own criterion to be adequate and its object to be what it takes it to be. Then there is the perspective of the philosopher watching natural consciousness undergo its experience. The philosopher does not intervene. The philosopher observes. Natural consciousness itself discovers the gap between its criterion and its actual achievement. When the gap becomes intolerable, natural consciousness revises itself, producing a new shape of consciousness. What the philosopher sees that natural consciousness does not is that the new shape of consciousness that emerges from this failure is not accidental. The new shape is constituted by precisely the content that the previous shape was forced to include in order to resolve its internal tension. Natural consciousness experiences this as a new beginning, as if it were starting fresh. The philosopher sees it as a determinate result. A concrete case, the section on force and the understanding in the phenomenology. Perception, the shape that replaced sense certainty, grasped objects as things with properties. But this raised a new problem. How do the multiple properties of a thing cohere into a single thing rather than a mere collection? The understanding introduces force as the explanatory concept, the inner principle that unifies the thing's manifestations. But force is only ever known through its expressions, its manifestations in appearance. The inner force behind the appearances is never directly accessible. It is posited as an explanation, but never confirmed independently of what it is supposed to explain. The understanding finds itself postulating an inverted world, a supersensible realm of forces that mirrors appearance without being accessible through it. This generates the instability that drives the phenomenology into self-consciousness. The contemporary dispute about this method concerns whether immanent critique succeeds without a background normative standard. Hegel's claim is that each shape of consciousness is evaluated purely internally, without an external standard being imported. But critics, including Sally Sedgwick and some Frankfurt School interpreters, argue that recognizing a gap between a shape's criterion and its achievement already requires a standard of what a gap is, which is not itself immanent. If there is a hidden external standard operating in Hegel's critique, then the method is not as self-sufficient as it claims, and the transitions are less necessary than advertised. Part 9. Recognition, self-consciousness, and the dialectic that has no exit. The Phenomenology's movement from consciousness to self-consciousness is not a psychological transition from knowing objects to knowing oneself. It is driven by a structural argument. The concept of the object that consciousness was tracking in the understanding section turned out to have the same structure as consciousness itself. The object was constituted by relations of negation and identity that mirror the structure of self-referring thought. Consciousness, in coming to understand its object fully, was actually tracking itself without knowing it. Self-consciousness, once it arrives, faces its own structural problem immediately. Self-consciousness is consciousness that takes itself as its object. But a self that simply contemplates itself, that has no other reference, is empty. Self-consciousness requires something other than itself to be self-conscious of, something that is its own otherness. Desire is the first form this takes. Self-consciousness asserts itself by negating and consuming what is other to it, as in hunger satisfied by eating. But satisfied desire does not produce durable self-consciousness. The object is consumed, the desire returns, and nothing permanent is established. For genuine self-consciousness, the other that self-consciousness relates to must be able to recognize it as a self-consciousness. A rock, an animal, a consumed object cannot confer recognition. Only another self-consciousness can do this, because only another self-consciousness has the conceptual structure to recognize a self as a self. Self-consciousness, therefore, essentially requires another self-consciousness to encounter it, struggle with it, and recognize it. The encounter between two self-consciousnesses produces the famous dialectic of lordship and bondage, which is what Hegel actually calls it, not master and slave, though the latter has become standard in translation. Both self-consciousnesses initially try to assert themselves by negating the other, treating the other as a mere thing. The dialectic moves through a life-and-death struggle. But death is dialectically useless. A dead other cannot recognize you. The struggle stops when one of the two, rather than face death, submits and acknowledges the other's primacy. The one who submitted becomes the bondsman, the worker. The one acknowledged becomes the lord. The reversal is the philosophically crucial moment. The Lord, having the recognition it sought, receives recognition from something it has already degraded to the status of a non-free, non-independent consciousness. But recognition from a degraded consciousness is not the genuine recognition that self-consciousness requires. It is an empty acknowledgement from a non-equal, and the Lord's self-consciousness remains unfulfilled because what recognized it was not itself recognizing freely. The Lord's position is dialectically unstable from the start. The bondsman, meanwhile, encounters the world through labour. Through work, the bondsman externalizes its inner projects, shapes the world according to its own conception, and then sees itself in the worked world as in a mirror. The bondsman's consciousness, constrained by service, develops a form of self-recognition through the transformation of the objective world that the lord, who only consumes what the bondsman produces, cannot achieve. The dialectic reverses. The apparent inferior becomes the locus of genuine self-development. The structural argument here is not primarily about historical slavery or labour relations, though it has obvious implications for both. It is an argument about what self-consciousness structurally requires, an other that is genuinely other, genuinely free, and genuinely capable of recognition, so that the recognition it confers is worth having. No finite arrangement of two self-consciousnesses satisfies this requirement completely. Every arrangement either degrades the other to a non-equal, making its recognition worthless, or makes the other an equal, but then faces the problem that recognition from an equal still depends on a fragile symmetry that either party can disrupt. The recognition regress here is not resolved within the lordship and bondage section. The Phenomenology's movement through Stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness is the story of self-consciousness trying to achieve stable self-relation without an adequate other. Each shape fails for structural reasons traceable to the original problem. A finite self-consciousness cannot achieve fully adequate recognition from another finite self-consciousness. Whether the eventual resolution in Geist, the social and historical whole in which individual self-consciousnesses participate, genuinely solves this structural problem or simply defers it to a higher level, is one of the most contested questions in contemporary Hegel scholarship. Part 10. The Doctrine of Essence. Reflection, Appearance, and the Logic's Hardest Moves. The science of logic has three main divisions: the doctrine of being, the doctrine of essence, and the doctrine of the concept. Of the three, the doctrine of essence, which occupies the middle position, is the most technically demanding and the most frequently skipped by readers who want Hegel's conclusions without the machinery that produces them. Skipping it is a mistake. The logic's hardest structural claims, including the claim that contradiction is the ground of all movement in reality, are made and defended here, not in the more discussed doctrine of being. Being Logic, the first book, dealt with immediate determinations, concepts taken in their directness before their mediated character was acknowledged. Quality, quantity, and measure are categories of being logic. They describe how something simply is, presented without reference to a ground behind the presentation. Essence logic begins from the recognition that the apparent immediacy of being was a one-sided abstraction. Behind appearance there is an essence. The immediate is not simply what it immediately appears to be. The very distinction between essence and appearance, however, generates its own structural problem immediately. If essence is what something really is behind its appearances, and if appearance is the surface that masks essence, then we have a split between a real interior and a deceptive exterior. This is the framework of many metaphysical and epistemological positions. Plato's forms behind the sensible world, Kant's things in themselves behind phenomena, scientific realism's underlying microstructure behind observable properties. Hegel's move in the doctrine of essence is to show that this framework is internally unstable. The key concept in the opening of essence logic is Schein in German. Hegel distinguishes Schein from appearance, Erscheinung, which introduces a specific technical requirement. Shine is the residual appearance left over when you have subtracted the apparent from a thing to get at its essence. The shine is what the thing is not, but the shine is there, and it is the shine that makes the essence appear. Here is the instability. If essence is supposed to be what remains after you strip away the inessential show, the shine, then the essence requires the shine in order to be recognized as essence. The essence that was supposed to be independent of appearance turns out to need appearance in order to manifest itself as essence. The doctrine of essence works through this instability systematically, developing categories of reflection, including identity, difference, contradiction, and ground. The contradiction chapter is where Hegel makes his strongest claim. Contradiction is not a defect in thought, but the innermost principle of all movement and vitality. A thing that did not contain contradiction within itself would be inert, static, and without internal dynamism. Contradiction is what drives things to develop, change, and resolve themselves into higher forms. Stephen Holgate's careful reading of the doctrine of essence in his 2006 book The Opening of Hegel's Logic tracks these moves as constituting a genuine argument, not a rhetorical device. The category of ground, Grund, that emerges from the contradiction chapter is particularly important. The ground is what a thing is in virtue of having its essence become essential, having its inner determinations generate rather than merely hide its appearances. Holgate argues that Hegel's contradiction in essence logic is ontological, not merely epistemic. It is a feature of things, not just of our concepts of them. This is one of the points at which the non-metaphysical reading of Pippin and the traditional metaphysical reading diverge most sharply. The objection that most defenders of essence logic find hardest to answer comes from the theory of reflection itself. Hegel's account of reflection, the movement of thought that posits its own ground and then recognizes that the ground was posited by the very movement that it was supposed to ground, involves a circularity. Dieter Hendrich, in work beginning in the 1960s, argued that Hegel's solution to the problem of self-grounding cognition in the doctrine of essence inherits a structural problem from Fichte's attempt to ground the I on itself. The first act of positing cannot itself be accounted for within the system of reflection. Henrich's critique, developed further in his 1982 essay collection Selbstverhältnisse, is that Hegel's reflective structure requires a prior moment of spontaneous self-relation that the logic treats as given rather than derived. Whether Hegel has a satisfactory response to this is still disputed in the literature, and it is precisely the kind of objection that defenders of Hegel find hardest to dismiss, because it accepts Hegel's own framework to generate the problem. Part 11. The Doctrine of the Concept, Subjectivity, Objectivity, and the Idea. When Hegel calls the third division of the logic the subjective logic, the contrast with the objective logic of being and essence requires careful handling. Subjective does not mean private, psychological, or confined to individual minds. It means the domain in which the structure of conceptuality itself becomes the explicit subject matter in which thought examines its own structure as thought, rather than tracking categories that present themselves as features of an external world. The doctrine of the concept is where being and essence reconceive themselves as, and turn out to have always been, forms of the concept. The concept Begriff with a capital B in Hegel's usage is not a concept in the ordinary sense of a mental representation or a linguistic meaning. It is the structure of conceptuality as such, the activity of self-differentiating universality. The concept is universal in that it encompasses particulars under it, particular in that it specifies and differentiates itself into determinate cases, and individual or singular in that it exists only in concrete, self-unified instances. These three aspects, universality, particularity, and individuality, are not three parts of the concept, but three moments of its self-articulation. What makes this structurally important is Hegel's claim that the concept is not merely the form through which we grasp things, but the form through which things are what they are. The intelligibility of a thing, what it is to be that thing, is not a feature added to the thing by a knowing subject, but is internal to the thing's own constitution. A living organism is what it is by virtue of the concept organism, meaning by virtue of the organizational structure that makes it a unity of parts directed towards self-maintenance. The concept is not projected onto the organism from outside. It is what the organism is. Judgment and syllogism in the doctrine of the concept are not merely formal logical structures, but ontological categories. The judgment, "the rose is red," is, for Hegel, a claim about the structure of the rose's being, not merely about how we classify it. Hegel traces the development of judgment forms from the most abstract immediate judgment, "the rose is red," through increasingly complex forms, the judgment of reflection, the judgment of necessity, and the judgment of the concept. Each more complex judgment form captures more of the genuine structure of a thing's constitution. The doctrine of the concept then moves from subjectivity through objectivity to the idea. Mechanism, chemism, and teleology are presented as categories of objectivity, ways in which objects are structured. Mechanism is the domain of external relations, where things influence each other through impact and without any inner principle of unity. Chemism introduces differentiation through inner affinity, where things are constituted by their tendency to unite with complementary others. Teleology is the category under which objects are organized around an inner end, where the whole determines the character of the parts. Hegel argues that mechanism and chemism cannot fully account for themselves, and that teleology is a more adequate category for understanding organized structures. The idea, ID, is the unity of the concept and objectivity, the situation in which the conceptual structure of a thing and the thing's actual organization coincide. The idea is not an additional metaphysical entity. It is the condition in which a thing's inner concept is fully realized in its actual existence. The highest form of the idea in the logic is the absolute idea, where conceptual thought grasps its own structure as the structure of being itself. The absolute idea is not a thing. It is the logical structure of rational self-comprehension. The hardest question the doctrine of the concept raises, and the one that the Pippin versus traditional metaphysics dispute turns on most directly, is whether the claim that the concept is the structure of things is a claim about reality or about the conditions of our ability to talk about reality. Pippin's position is that the logic is a science of the conditions of rational discourse, not a derivation of the structure of mind-independent being. The traditional reading, represented by Michael Inwood, Charles Taylor, and in different ways by James Kreines, holds that the logic's claims are genuinely about what there is, not merely about the structure of our commitments. The difference is significant because on Pippin's reading, the doctrine of the concept makes no stronger claim than a sophisticated Kantian would make, while on the traditional reading it makes a very strong claim that Kant would regard as dogmatic metaphysics. Part 12. Contradiction in the logic. What Hegel means and why formal logicians are not simply right. Hegel writes in the Doctrine of Essence that contradiction is the root of all movement and life, and that it is only insofar as something contains a contradiction within itself that it moves, has an urge, and is active. Formal logicians read this and diagnose a violation of the law of non-contradiction, the logical principle that no proposition can be both true and false at the same time in the same respect. The diagnosis is that Hegel is either confused or using contradiction in a loose, non-logical sense that does not actually challenge formal logic. Neither dismissal is satisfactory, and the question of what Hegel means by contradiction is one of the most technically active in current scholarship. There are three interpretive positions that need to be distinguished precisely. The first is the paraphrase reading, Hegel uses contradiction loosely to mean tension, opposition, or dynamic instability, and his claims do not challenge the law of non-contradiction at all because he is not asserting that any proposition is both true and false. On this reading, Hegel's logic is perfectly compatible with classical formal logic. It just operates at a different level, examining the self-differentiating structure of concepts rather than truth-functional relations between propositions. This reading was popular among neo-Kantian and early analytic commentators. The second position is the dialetheist reading, developed most rigorously by Graham Priest, beginning in the late 1980s. Priest argues that Hegel genuinely affirms true contradictions, propositions that are both true and false simultaneously, and that Hegel should be read as an ancestor of dialetheism. The logical view that some contradictions are true and that inference should be conducted with a paraconsistent logic that does not allow any contradiction to entail everything. Paraconsistency, to define it precisely, is the property of a logical system in which a contradiction does not entail every proposition, in which from P and not P you cannot derive any arbitrary Q. Priest has argued that Hegel's contradiction claims are genuine logical ones, and that Hegel's logic should be formalized using paraconsistent tools. The third position, developed by Michela Bourdignon in a 2019 paper and in subsequent work, tries to distinguish Hegel's position from Priest's dialetheism without retreating to the paraphrase reading. Bourdignon argues that Hegel affirms logical contradictions, contradictions in the full logical sense, but that his notion of truth is developmental rather than static. A contradiction is true in Hegel's logic not in the sense that a proposition and its negation are both simultaneously true at a fixed instant, but in the sense that the contradiction is the driving moment of a process whose truth is the process as a whole. The truth of the contradiction is the Aufhebung that results from it, not the bare co-presence of affirmation and negation. This is a substantive distinction, and it has real consequences. Priest's dialetheism is static, in the sense that the dialetheia, the true contradiction, is a fixed feature of the logical situation. Hegel's contradictions are dynamic, They are moments in a process that resolves them into higher determinations. The contradiction is true as the engine of the dialectical movement, not as a logical truth that simply stands alongside its negation. On this reading, Hegel is committed neither to classical logic nor to simple dialetheism, but to something that requires a logic of process, in which truth is not a static predicate of propositions, but a feature of unfolding determinations. What formal logicians are right about is this. If Hegel's contradiction claims are interpreted as asserting static co-presence of P and not P, then the law of non-contradiction is violated and the entire system trivializes, because from any contradiction you can derive anything. This consequence would make the logic worthless as a discriminating account of rational categories. What formal logicians are wrong about is assuming that their own static conception of contradiction is the only coherent one. The question of whether a logic of process, in which contradictions are true as moments of determinate developmental structures rather than as static co-presences, is a coherent formal framework, is genuinely open in contemporary philosophy of logic. Elena Ficara's recent work, developing Hegelian logic using the resources of non-classical logic, represents the most technically rigorous attempt to work this out. It remains unresolved, and its resolution matters for whether Hegel's logic is defensible at all, not just as a historical position, but as a live philosophical proposal. Part 13. Teleology without a teleologist, the hardest structural claim in Hegel. Teleology, as a concept in the history of philosophy, comes in two varieties, and conflating them produces almost every serious misreading of Hegel on this topic. The first variety is external teleology. A designer or intelligent agent who exists independently of the system imposes a purpose on it from outside. A watchmaker designs a watch for the purpose of telling time. The watch's functional organization is explained by the watchmaker's prior intention. The second variety is immanent teleology. A system is organized around an end that is intrinsic to the system itself, not imposed from outside by any external agent. Kant analyzed immanent teleology carefully in the Critique of Judgment, using the living organism as the paradigm case. An organism's parts are organized not by an external designer, but by the living whole, where the whole determines what the parts must be, and how they must function in order for the organism to sustain itself. Kant's position on immanent teleology was rigorously restricted. He argued that we need the concept of inner purposiveness to understand living things, but we are not entitled to treat this concept as describing how organisms actually are, in themselves, as opposed to how we must think about them given the limits of mechanical explanation. Inner purposiveness is a regulative concept, a useful heuristic for biology, not a constitutive claim about the real structure of organisms. Hegel's move against Kant on this point is precise and consequential. Kant's restriction fails on its own terms, because Kant cannot explain why mechanical explanation is insufficient for biology without committing to the claim that organisms genuinely have a structure that mechanism cannot capture. The admission that we must use teleological concepts is an implicit admission that something about organisms requires them. Hegel draws a further consequence from James Krines's careful reconstruction. The concept of an organism requires that a general kind, a species concept, be the substance or nature of an individual organism. What it is to be a tiger is determined by the concept tiger, by the kind, not by the mechanical processes that happen to produce a tiger-shaped body. The concept is the inner principle of the organism's organization, the standard against which the organism's actual state is measured. A diseased tiger is a tiger that fails to instantiate the concept tiger fully. This failure makes sense only if the concept is immanent in the organism, not merely a label applied by an external classifier. The structural hardness of this claim becomes visible when you ask what drives the dialectical progression in Hegel's logic through mechanism, chemism and teleology. Mechanism, as already discussed, is the category of purely external relations, where things influence each other without any inner principle of self-organization. When mechanism is pushed to its limits, it reveals an instability. You cannot individuate mechanical objects at all without presupposing some principle that makes each thing a unified thing, rather than an arbitrary region of matter. The very concept of a distinct object requires something more than external relations. This opens into chemism, where things are constituted by their affinities, their tendencies to combine with and separate from complementary others. But chemism still treats the drive toward combination as an external goal. The acid seeks the base, but there is no inner principle that constitutes the acid as the kind of thing that seeks bases. Immanent teleology, the concept of an organized whole whose parts are constituted by their function within the whole, is what mechanism and chemism cannot account for on their own. Kevin Thompson and others, in a 2023 cluster of papers in Hegel Bulletin, have argued that Hegel's teleology chapter in the Logic is not primarily about organisms at all, but about the abstract logical structure of purposive activity as such, including human action and technical production. On this reading, the deeper argument is that any account of what it means to do something, to act toward an end, requires the concept of immanent purposiveness. External teleology always presupposes immanent teleology at a deeper level, because even an external designer's act of designing requires a prior immanent self-organizing structure in the designer. The objection that most troubles defenders of Hegelian teleology is not Kant's restriction, but what we might call the naturalization problem. Contemporary natural science has achieved explanatory frameworks for living systems, including evolutionary biology, that do not obviously require immanent teleological categories in Hegel's strong sense. Selection pressures and historical accident, rather than immanent conceptual structures, account for biological organization. Kreines' response is that Hegel's claim is not about which causal mechanisms produce organisms, but about which explanatory framework captures what it is to be an organism, which is a different question. Whether that distinction is ultimately sustainable, or whether it retreats to a merely epistemic claim about explanation that Hegel would himself reject, remains genuinely open. Part 14. Geist, the ontological commitment you cannot deflate away. Geist, translated as spirit or mind, is the concept that most sharply divides readers of Hegel along interpretive lines. On the deflationary reading associated with Pippin and Pinkard, Geist is not an entity at all. Not a cosmic consciousness, not a world mind that thinks through human beings. It is a name for the structure of self-conscious, norm-governed rational activity as it unfolds historically in and through communities of agents. On this reading, saying Geist develops means that the social norms, practices and standards through which rational self-understanding is enacted change, develop, and become more adequate over time. There is no spooky metaphysics here, only social ontology and the history of reason's self-clarification. On the traditional metaphysical reading, associated with Charles Taylor, the early Michael Inwood, and more recently James Crines and Robert Stern, Geist involves genuine ontological commitments that cannot be deflated into social normative terms without serious distortion. The logics claim that the concept is the inner nature of things, not merely our way of categorizing them, requires that conceptual structures be constitutive features of reality, not just of our representations of it. Geist's development is not just the historical development of human norms, but the movement of the conceptual structure of reality itself toward greater self-transparency. The universe, in some non-trivially idealist sense, is organized by the same rational structures that govern thought. Pippin's 2019 study of the science of logic tried to close the gap between these positions. Pippin now acknowledges that the logic makes claims about the structure of being, not merely about the conditions of our discourse about being. But he maintains that being so understood is not independent of conceptual articulation in any pre-Kantian sense. There is a speculative identity between the categories of thought and the categories of being, but this identity is not the relation between a mind and a mind-independent world. It is the identity of thought structure with the structure of intelligibility as such, where what it is to be something is to be intelligible in a specific way. Whether this is a genuine ontological position or a sophisticated re-description of Kantian transcendental conditions is what the debate turns on. The practical stake of this debate is high. If Geist is merely social normative, then the philosophy of right's claims about the rationality of modern institutions and the lectures on the philosophy of history's claims about the rational necessity of historical development are claims about the internal logic of human practices, not about the structure of reality. This makes them revisable, subject to critique and reconstruction, tools for social analysis, rather than metaphysical claims about how things must be. If Geist is ontologically robust in the traditional sense, then these claims are claims about what reason demands at the level of reality, and their normative force comes from a source that transcends the contingency of any particular social arrangement. Honneth's recognition theory, Pippin's social theory of agency, and Pinkard's account of shapes of spirit take the first path. All three leave open the question of whether their reconstructions capture what Hegel was actually doing or replace him with something more defensible but different. Part 15. Sittlichkeit and the Social Ontology. Why individual spirit is not the unit of analysis. The movement in the philosophy of right from abstract right through morality to ethical life, Sittlichkeit, is not simply an ordering of topics. It is a dialectical argument that each prior conception of practical freedom fails because it abstracts from the social conditions that make it possible, and that the failure produces the next more adequate conception. Abstract right is freedom conceived as the sphere of external negative liberty. The individual's right to own property, make contracts, and not be interfered with by others. This is Isaiah Berlin's negative freedom, the freedom of classical liberalism. Hegel does not dismiss it, but he argues that it is unstable on its own terms. A right without enforcement is no right at all, and enforcement requires a social and legal framework that abstract right itself cannot generate or justify. The concept of punishment, for instance, cannot be derived from abstract right alone. It requires a conception of wrong that already presupposes an ethical community. Morality is freedom conceived as the sphere of the autonomous moral subject who legislates for herself through reason. This is Kant's moral philosophy. The individual will is the source of moral law, duty is internal, and the standard of right action is universalizability. Hegel's critique here is not that moral autonomy is unimportant, but that it cannot sustain itself in abstraction from concrete social content. The Kantian moral subject, stripped of all particular social roles and commitments, has no determinate content to universalize. The categorical imperative requires actual particular maxims to test, and those maxims come from somewhere, from social practices, cultural norms, concrete roles and relationships. Morality without Sittlichkeit is an empty formalism that can sanction contradictory maxims, as Hegel argues in his famous critique of Kant. Sittlichkeit is the sphere in which freedom is actualized in concrete institutional form, the family, civil society, and the state. What makes Sittlichkeit philosophically distinctive is Hegel's claim that individuals achieve genuine freedom not in spite of their social roles and institutional memberships, but through them. A person who is a parent, a professional, a citizen inhabiting determinate social roles is not less free than a Kantian abstract subject. She is more free because she has a concrete shape to her freedom rather than an abstract potential. The institutions of Sittlichkeit are not external constraints on a pre-social freedom. They are the medium through which freedom becomes actual. Friedrich Neuhaus's 2000 reconstruction identified three distinct conceptions of freedom operating in Hegel's social theory: personal freedom, moral freedom, and what Neuhauser calls social freedom, the mode of freedom constituted by individuals' participation in rational social institutions where their ends are also the community's ends. Social freedom is Hegel's most distinctive contribution, and the one that has no clear precedent in Kant or in liberal political philosophy. An individual participates in social freedom when her own projects are simultaneously contributions to a shared form of life, when she is at home in the institutions she inhabits rather than constrained by them. This requires that the institutions themselves have a structure that accommodates individual self-realization rather than suppressing it. The hardest objection to Sittlichkeit is not Karl Popper's facile accusation of proto-totalitarianism, which confuses the claim that institutions are constitutive of freedom with the claim that any existing institution must be rationally endorsed. The harder objection is that Hegel's identification of rational freedom with the modern state at a specific historical moment, late 18th century Europe, is an illegitimate closure of the dialectic. If Sittlichkeit's rationality is historically indexed, then any claim that a particular set of institutions is the actualization of freedom is a political claim with a philosophical gloss rather than a philosophical claim with determinate content. Axel Honneth's Freedom's Right from 2011 attempted to reconstruct Sittlichkeit on purely immanent critical grounds, evaluating contemporary institutions against the freedom claims they themselves make, without Hegel's metaphysical backstory. Whether this reconstruction is still recognizably Hegelian, or whether it borrows only the dialectical style while abandoning the engine that drives it, is contested in current social philosophy. Part 16. History and the Cunning of Reason. The Argument and its Wreckage. Hegel's philosophy of history makes a claim that even his sympathizers find difficult to defend without embarrassment, and a claim that his critics find so easy to lampoon that they often stop there, missing what is philosophically serious about the surrounding framework. The claim is this: world history, taken as a whole, is the realization of freedom, and the apparently senseless violence, exploitation and suffering that constitute most of recorded history serve as necessary instruments for this realization, used by reason without the knowledge of the individuals who perpetrate them. Hegel calls this the cunning of reason. The universal uses particular passions and interests as its means without consulting them and without their understanding what they are doing. The argument preceding this claim is more careful than the claim itself. Hegel's starting point in the lectures on the philosophy of history is the observation that historical agents act from particular passions and interests, not from universal rational purposes. Napoleon did not conquer Europe because he was working out the logic of freedom consciousness. He had personal ambitions, strategic interests, and an extraordinary military mind. Yet the historical consequence of Napoleon's campaigns, including the codification of law, the abolition of feudal structures across Europe, and the dissemination of revolutionary principles, was the advancement of rational freedom in institutions, whatever Napoleon intended. The cunning of reason is Hegel's attempt to explain how history can have rational progressive structure without any of its individual actors consciously tracking that structure. The universal end is realized through particular passions precisely because particular passions are powerful enough to move people to actions that have large-scale structural consequences. World historical individuals, as Hegel calls them, are people whose particular ambitions happen to align with the next required step in the development of freedom consciousness in institutions. They do not know this. They are not working for it consciously, and they typically gain nothing from it personally. 3 separate objections carry genuine philosophical force. The first is Popper's, though not quite in his version of it. The claim that history has a rational direction cannot be falsified, because any apparently irrational episode can always be reinterpreted as a necessary moment in the rational progression. The philosophical cost is that the claim has no determinate content. It says history is rational, but cannot say in advance what rationality requires in any specific case. Hegel explicitly acknowledges that the philosophical account of history is retrospective, which means it cannot serve as a guide to action. The second objection is ethical. The cunning of reason treats the suffering of actual persons as instruments for a purpose they did not consent to and did not share. Hegel is candid about this in the lectures, acknowledging that history's progress is built on the wreckage of individual happiness, and that this is simply how things are at the level of world history. The ethical perspective, which demands that individuals not be treated merely as means, belongs to a lower level of spirit than world history, Hegel says. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable passage in all of Hegel's published writing. The third objection is the most structurally damaging. Hegel's argument requires that the development of freedom consciousness in institutions constitutes genuine progress, that the modern European state and its rational institutions represent a more adequate actualization of freedom than ancient Greek or Eastern forms. The criteria for what counts as progress are drawn from Hegel's own philosophical system. This means the argument is circular. The system provides the standard by which history is judged to be rational, and history is used to confirm the system. The circularity may be unavoidable given Hegel's own account of how philosophy relates to history, but it makes the claim to derive historical necessity from immanent critique rather than from dogmatic presupposition very difficult to sustain. Part 17. Art, Religion, Philosophy, Absolute Spirit, and Why the Ordering is Not Arbitrary. The final section of the Encyclopedia's Philosophy of Spirit, covering art, religion and philosophy as forms of absolute spirit, is treated in most introductory treatments as a tidy completion of the system. Thought finally knows itself as the structure of everything. This misses what is philosophically substantive about the ordering and why it is not arbitrary. Art, religion and philosophy do not differ merely in their subject matter. They differ in the form in which they present the same content, the structure of spirit self-recognition in its other. Art presents this content in sensuous particular form. A Greek statue of Apollo presents the identity of human and divine not as a proposition or a doctrine, but as a visible, specific presence that strikes the viewer directly. The Parthenon frieze presents civic and religious identity as organized stone that you can see, touch, and walk through. Art's mode of presentation is sensuous intuition. The absolute content is given an outer, perceptible shape. Art is limited precisely because it is adequate only to contents whose spiritual depth can be rendered sensuous without distortion. Classical Greek sculpture achieves this adequacy. The content, a vision of human-divine unity in a particular human form, fits the medium. Religion presents the same content, the structure of spirit self-recognition, in the form of Vorstellung, representation or pictorial thought. Vorstellung is a specifically Hegelian technical term. It names the cognitive mode of thought that grasps conceptual content through images, narratives and personifications rather than through pure concepts. The Christian doctrines of the Incarnation and Trinity are, for Hegel, Vorstellungen of the same content that the logic expresses through the categories of being, essence, and concept. The Trinity in its religious form presents the structure of universality, particularity, and individuality as three persons and their relations. The logic presents the same structure through pure conceptual determination. Religion is more adequate than art because it grasps that the content is spiritual rather than sensuous, but less adequate than philosophy because it grasps the content through images and narratives that remain external to the concept. Philosophy presents this content in the form of the pure concept, Begriff, without sensuous or pictorial supplement. Philosophy's superiority over art and religion is not a superiority of content, but a superiority of the form in which content is held. The concept grasps what art and religion picture, and it does so in the mode of thought that is adequate to thought's own self-determination. Hegel is explicit that art and religion are not abolished by philosophy. They remain as forms of spirit's self-presentation. Art does not become obsolete when philosophy grasps its content conceptually, any more than friendship becomes obsolete when psychology explains attachment. The live debate about this triad concerns Hegel's claim that art has passed its highest vocation in the modern age, the famous end of art thesis. Hegel does not say that art ceases to exist in modernity or that no great art will be made. He says that art can no longer function as the primary vehicle through which a culture's deepest self-understanding is formed and transmitted, because in modernity the form of reflective self-consciousness has become paramount, and art's sensuous immediacy cannot satisfy the need for explicit conceptual self-comprehension. Stephen Houlgate and William Desmond have argued that this claim is more restricted than it appears, and that Hegel's own aesthetics contains resources for acknowledging art's continued capacity for absolute expression. Whether the end of art claim is a substantive argument tied to Hegel's theory of modernity or a historically parochial observation dressed in systematic language is a debate that the discovery in 2022 of previously unknown transcripts of Hegel's Heidelberg aesthetics lectures containing significantly different formulations has reopened. Part 18. What absolute knowing is not, and the deflationary reading. The Phenomenology of Spirit ends with a chapter called Absolute Knowing, and every reader who arrives there faces the same question. Has this earned its conclusion, or has it simply announced it? The chapter is startlingly brief, given the enormous journey that precedes it, and most of what it says concerns the relationship between the phenomenology and the logic, not a new philosophical content. The most common misreading takes absolute knowing to be a cognitive state, in which a subject has finally succeeded in knowing reality as it is in itself, eliminating all the distortions of finite partial perspectives. On this reading, the phenomenology arrives at a God's-eye view, a complete and unobstructed knowledge of the whole. This is not what Hegel means, and the textual evidence against it is decisive. Absolute knowing is described as the shape of consciousness in which the opposition between consciousness and its object has been overcome, not in the sense that the object has been fully inspected, but in the sense that consciousness has recognized that the object was never truly separate from the categories through which it was known. Brandam's reconstruction of absolute knowing in A Spirit of Trust, published in 2019, offers the most technically detailed recent account. For Brandam, absolute knowing is the recognitional achievement in which a community of rational agents has learned to treat its own practices of attributing and acknowledging commitments as themselves the subject matter of philosophical inquiry. The phenomenology is a retrospective rational reconstruction of how the current normative framework, the framework within which we now operate, came to be, by showing how its predecessors failed and what they contributed. Absolute knowing is not a view from nowhere, but a reflective self-understanding of the tradition that is one's own, achieved through the full recollection of that tradition's development. The deflationary reading, at its strongest, says something like this. Absolute knowing is the recognition that there is no foundation outside of the practices of rational inquiry that could justify those practices, combined with the recognition that this absence of external foundation is not a deficiency, but a mark of the maturity of rational self-legislation. Thought has no ground beneath it. Its ground is itself. This is not a regress, but a circle, and Hegel argues that recognizing the circle as a circle is the philosophical achievement of absolute knowing. The objection that even sympathetic readers find hard to dismiss is this. If absolute knowing is purely retrospective, a recollective rationalization of past failures that does not claim any predictive or prescriptive force, then it arrives too late and does too little. Hegel himself says in a famous passage that the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only at dusk, that philosophy can only comprehend its world when that world is already complete. This is an admission that philosophy offers understanding, not guidance. If absolute knowing merely recounts what has already happened without being able to prescribe what should happen next, then Hegel's system is a monument to the past, architecturally impressive but not action-guiding. Comey and Ruder's 2018 book The Dash argues that this retrospective character is not a limitation but a structural feature of speculative thought, and that the punctuation Hegel uses between the phenomenology's last word and the logic's first word encodes precisely this open, non-terminating character of absolute knowing. Whether this rehabilitates or merely aestheticizes the limitation is a question the book raises without resolving. Part 19. The Circularity Problem, Vicious, Virtuous, or Unavoidable. The circularity problem in Hegel's system is not a single problem, but a family of related structural concerns, and they need to be kept distinct because they have different weights. Treating them as one inflates a genuine challenge into an apparently fatal objection. Treating them as nothing deflates a real limitation into a literary device. The first circularity is methodological. The phenomenology of spirit is supposed to clear the ground for the logic by demonstrating that all presuppositions have been examined and that pure thinking without presuppositions is now possible. But the phenomenology itself employs philosophical categories, including those of consciousness, object, negation, and experience that have not yet been derived. The starting point of the presuppositionless inquiry already presupposes the categories it is supposed to derive. This is Henrich's version of the problem, and it has not been definitively answered. Hulgate's response is that the presuppositions operative in the phenomenology are derived and vindicated by the logic that follows it, and that the relationship is therefore circular in a virtuous rather than a vicious sense. The second circularity concerns the logic itself. Hegel says at the end of the science of logic that the absolute idea, the final result of the logic, returns to its beginning, to pure being. The logic is literally circular. Its ending is its beginning, made comprehensible by the whole. On Hulgate's reading, this circularity is virtuous because it means that the logic has justified its own starting point retrospectively. You needed to go through the whole to see why being, mere being, was the only possible beginning. Critics, including Michael Rosen, argue that this retroactive self-justification is the kind of philosophical self-congratulation that looks rigorous but guarantees nothing. The third circularity is the most damaging and the least discussed in introductory treatments. Hegel's system is supposed to proceed from immanent critique, examining each position against its own standards rather than importing external criteria. But the determination of what counts as a position's own standard and what constitutes a failure against that standard requires a philosophical framework that is already operative in the examination. The examiner is never outside the examined. This is not a defect unique to Hegel. Every philosophical system faces some version of this problem. But it is a defect that Hegel's system is particularly exposed to, because his method makes the strongest possible claim to self-grounding immanence. The recent Hegel literature has largely shifted from treating circularity as a refutation to treating it as a structural feature to be understood and evaluated. Brandam's claim, in a spirit of trust that the Phenomenology exemplifies the very kind of recollective rationality it describes, is a frank embrace of self-referential circularity. The book's reconstruction is itself an instance of the rational recollection it analyzes. Whether this is self-grounding in the virtuous sense or simply self-reinforcing in a way that excludes critical purchase from outside the system, is a question that the most recent critics, including Sean Kelly and James Kreines in a 2020 symposium in the Australasian Philosophical Review, have targeted precisely. Part 20. Dieter Henrich and the Reflection-Theoretic critique. Dieter Henrich's contribution to Hegel's scholarship is unusual in that it is primarily a diagnosis of a structural problem rather than a defense of a position, and it has proven more durable than most positive readings, because it forces defenders to address a specifically located difficulty rather than a vague concern about obscurity. The problem Henrich identifies is the structure of self-consciousness as Hegel inherits and attempts to solve it. The problem begins in Fichte. Fichte needed to ground the system of knowledge in the self's immediate self-knowledge, the I's relation to itself as the absolute first principle. The self must know itself if knowledge is to have an unconditioned starting point. But how can the self know itself? If the self knows itself by an act of reflection, then self-knowledge is mediated, produced by an act of reflection that is distinct from the self being reflected. The self that reflects is not the same as the self being reflected on, which means the self-coincidence, that was supposed to be immediate and absolute, is in fact mediated and not absolute. Henrich showed in a series of essays beginning with his 1966 paper on Fichte's original insight that any attempt to ground self-consciousness in an act of self-reflection faces this problem. Reflection produces the appearance of self-coincidence, but actually produces a duality: the reflecting I and the reflected upon I. You need a prior, non-reflective self-acquaintance to close the gap, but this prior self-acquaintance is precisely what the theory was supposed to explain. Fichte's various attempts to solve this problem all either reintroduce the duality at a higher level or posit a primitive non-reflective self-acquaintance that is left unexplained. Hegel's response, worked out in the Phenomenology and the Doctrine of Essence, is to abandon the model of a pre-social, pre-linguistic, immediate self-coincidence and locate self-consciousness in the structure of recognition. Self-consciousness is not something a subject achieves by reflecting on itself in isolation. It is constituted through the encounter with another self-consciousness that recognizes it. This move to intersubjectivity is Hegel's most celebrated response to the Fichtean problem. Henrich argues, however, that the recognition structure does not fully escape the difficulty. For recognition to constitute self-consciousness rather than merely mediate it, the two self-consciousnesses that enter the encounter must already be able to take a position with respect to each other, which requires that they already have a form of self-relation prior to the recognition encounter. If they do not, there is nothing there to be recognized. If they do, then the recognition structure did not originate self-consciousness, but only shaped it. The prior moment of non-reflective self-acquaintance, which Fichte needed, seems to be presupposed by Hegel's recognition story as well, merely displaced earlier. Henrich's later work, especially between Kant and Hegel, does not conclude that Hegel fails entirely, but that Hegel's theory of Geist as the social medium of self-consciousness presupposes a model of individual selfhood that it cannot fully derive from its own resources. The precise form of individual self-acquaintance that makes participation in social practices of recognition possible is a structure that Hegel's system treats as given rather than derived. Whether a fully reconstructed Hegelian account can respond to this by showing that individual self-acquaintance is itself always already socially constituted is the question that connects Henrich's critique to the Pippin-Pinkard normative reading and to Brandam's inferentialist account. The connection is not coincidental. Henrich's problem is exactly what the normative reading must solve if it is to be adequate to the full reach of Hegel's claims. Part 21. Pippin and Brandam's Hegel, the normative turn and what it saves. The normative turn in Hegel scholarship, inaugurated by Pippin in 1989 and extended by Brandam in 2019, is the most influential development in the field in the past 4 decades. It is also contested in ways that go beyond academic preference, because what is at stake is not just which reading of Hegel is correct, but whether Hegel's most ambitious claims can survive being rescued from their metaphysical shell. Pippin's central move in Hegel's idealism was to show that Hegel's project is best understood as a radicalization of Kant's transcendental inquiry into the conditions of the possibility of self-conscious experience. For Kant, the categories of the understanding are the conditions under which a subject can have experience at all. For Hegel, Pippin argues, the conditions of self-conscious rational agency are not fixed in a static table of categories, but are historically and socially constituted. They are the norms and practices through which a community of rational agents holds itself accountable and revises its standards over time. Geist is the ongoing historical process of this normative self-constitution and revision. Brandam's contribution in A Spirit of Trust, which took over 20 years to complete and runs to over 800 pages, extends the normative reading into a comprehensive account of the Phenomenology as a theory of rational agency as inferential practice. For Brandam, the key concept is not recognition in the political sense, but the deontic social practice of attributing and acknowledging inferential commitments, of holding one another responsible for the logical consequences of what one asserts. The Phenomenology traces the development of increasingly adequate conceptions of what it means for a community of rational agents to hold each other to norms of this kind. Absolute knowing is the achievement of a community that grasps the historical conditions of its own normative practices and can take responsibility for them. What this reading saves is enormous. It allows Hegel to be taken seriously as a systematic philosopher without requiring commitment to a world mind, a cosmic teleology, or a theory that the categories of logic are the furniture of the universe in any robust pre-Kantian sense. The result is a Hegel who is directly relevant to debates in action theory, philosophy of language, meta-ethics, and the social sciences without requiring any prior metaphysical loyalty. The connection to Wilfrid Seller's critique of the myth of the given, which Pippin made central, has been particularly productive. It allows a direct line from Hegel to John McDowell's account of experience as permeated by conceptual norms. What the reading costs is also substantial. The most persistent objection is that the normative reading simply cannot account for large portions of Hegel's text, above all the science of logic, without distortion or evasion. Kreines has pressed this objection across multiple publications. Hegel's logic is not a theory of the conditions of rational discourse, but a metaphysics of the actual structure of reality, and the normative readings Hegel has evacuated this commitment. Pippin's 2019 book is his most sustained response, conceding significantly more metaphysical content than his 1989 position, but still interpreting it through the lens of discursive self-articulation. The debate has become increasingly precise. The question is no longer whether Hegel has a metaphysics, but what kind, how thick its commitments are, and whether the forms of pure thinking and the forms of being are identical in a way that makes them genuinely mind-independent, or only systematically correlated with the structure of rational self-understanding. This question does not yet have a consensus answer. Part 22. The Marx Problem. What survives when you invert the dialectic? Marx's famous statement that he found the dialectic in Hegel standing on its head and set it right side up is among the most quoted and least examined sentences in the history of philosophy. The metaphor of inversion, in German Umstülpung, turning inside out, is not the same as reversal or negation, and the precise meaning of what Marx takes from Hegel and what he claims to have transformed is considerably more complex than either the standard Marxist or the standard anti-Hegelian accounts allow. The standard reading goes like this. Hegel made thought, the idea, primary, and treated material reality as the externalization of thought. Marx reversed this, making material productive activity primary and treating thought, consciousness, and ideology as epiphenomena of material conditions. This is the base superstructure model. The economic base determines the ideological superstructure, including religion, philosophy, art, and law. On this reading, Marx simply took the Hegelian dialectic's logical structure, including contradiction, negation, and resolution, and applied it to the history of class struggle and modes of production, rather than to the self-movement of the idea. This reading is inadequate to the actual relationship between Hegel's and Marx's dialectics, and several specific points show why. First, the young Marx's 1844 manuscripts do not simply invert Hegel, but engage with him at the level of the theory of alienation, arguing that Hegel correctly identified alienation as the fundamental structure of modern life, but located it in thought rather than in material labour. For Marx, alienated labour, the condition in which the worker produces objects that stand against her as alien powers, is the concrete reality of which Hegel's alienated consciousness is the abstract philosophical reflection. The inversion is not from thought to matter, but from the philosophical form to the practical content it expresses. Second, Marx's Capital uses the category of the commodity form in a way that is deeply indebted to Hegel's doctrine of essence. The commodity form of wealth, Marx argues in the first chapter of Capital, involves a specific inversion in which social relations between people appear as relations between things. Wages, prices, and profits appear as natural properties of objects rather than as historically specific social relations. This is commodity fetishism, and it is a Hegelian argument through and through. Appearance conceals essence. The immediate form of the commodity conceals the social relation of labour exploitation that constitutes its value. Frederick Jameson and others, in the tradition of what he calls the new dialectics, have argued that Hegel's logic, read through Marx, is revealed as the anticipatory form of the logic of capital itself, so that the idealist appearance of the logic was always already a reflection of the capitalist social form that produced it. What survives the inversion, on the strongest reading, is the dialectical method's core claim, that appearances are generated by and conceal underlying structural contradictions, that those contradictions drive development, and that critique must proceed from within the immanent logic of the structure being examined rather than from external moral standards. What gets lost or needs to be replaced is Hegel's confidence that the contradictions resolve themselves into an increasingly rational actualization of freedom. For Marx, the contradictions of capital do not resolve themselves. They require political intervention, the organized action of the class whose labor produces the structure that exploits it. The dialectic becomes critical and practical rather than speculative and contemplative. Whether this transformation is genuinely internal to the Hegelian dialectic, a radicalization of its immanent critical logic, or an abandonment of dialectic's core claim that thought can comprehend its own movement without external intervention, remains a disputed question at the intersection of Hegel scholarship and Marxist theory. Part 23. Adorno's Negative Dialectics, the most serious internal challenge. Adorno's Negative Dialectics, published in 1966, is the most sustained and philosophically rigorous critique of Hegel's dialectic to come from within the tradition that Hegel himself generated. It is not a refutation from outside. It is not an application of analytic techniques to expose confusion. And it is not a sociological debunking. It is an immanent critique using Hegel's own tools against Hegel's conclusions, and it is constructed with sufficient philosophical precision that its challenge cannot be dismissed by defenders of the tradition. Adorno's starting point is the concept of identity thinking, Identitätsdenken. Every concept, Adorno argues, is a tool of identity. It subsumes particulars under a universal, declaring them to be instances of a type and suppressing whatever about them does not fit the type. The concept table identifies a particular wooden object with every other table, treating their differences as accidental to their essential sameness. This is not merely a feature of ordinary practical thought, it structures science, law, and philosophy. The force of identity thinking is not neutral. It serves the social function of exchange, where things must be made equivalent in value in order to circulate as commodities. Identity thinking in philosophy and exchange value in economics are, for Adorno, expressions of the same social logic. Hegel, Adorno argues, recognized the problem of identity thinking and tried to overcome it through the dialectic. The dialectic keeps concepts in motion, shows how they pass into their opposites, and claims to produce a higher unity that preserves difference rather than suppressing it. But for Adorno, Hegel's dialectic is itself the highest form of identity thinking rather than its overcoming. The negation of a concept in the dialectic produces a new concept that subsumes both predecessor concepts under a higher identity. The particular, the singular object or moment that resists conceptual subsumption is not honoured in its singularity. It is used as the fuel for the production of more comprehensive universals. Aufhebung, whatever it preserves it as a moment in a unity that transcends it, not as a resistance to unity that persists. Adorno's alternative is what he calls the consistent consciousness of non-identity, the philosophical practice of attending to what in an object exceeds the concept under which it falls, of using the inadequacy of concepts as a means of approach rather than a defect to be overcome. As Lambert Zuiderwart has formulated it, the goal of thought is to honor objects in their non-identity, in their difference from what a restricted rationality declares them to be. This practice has no positive result in the Hegelian sense. It does not produce a new, more adequate concept that resolves the tension. The tension is maintained. The most penetrating question Adorno's negative dialectics must answer is the self-referential one. By what standard does negative dialectics criticize identity thinking? If negative dialectics uses concepts, which it must, and if concepts always involve identity thinking, then negative dialectics is implicated in what it criticizes. Adorno is aware of this and does not claim that negative dialectics escapes the condition it critiques. He calls his procedure an attempt to use the strength of the subject to break through the deception of constitutive subjectivity, which is a deliberately paradoxical formulation. Philosophy must use its tools critically against itself. Brian O'Connor and J.M. Bernstein have argued that this paradox is not a contradiction, but a recognition that critical practice must work from within its own constraints, which is itself a Hegelian insight turned against Hegel. Whether Adorno's negative dialectics is genuinely dialectical in any rigorous sense, or whether it is a style of philosophical writing that mimics the form of dialectical argument without its determinate content, is the deepest objection to the project. Habermas pressed this objection famously, arguing that Adorno's critique of reason is self-undermining because it cannot articulate the normative standard from which it criticizes without relying on a form of rationality it has put in question. Adorno's defenders, including Sailor Ben Habib and Axel Honneth in different ways, have argued that negative dialectics is best understood not as a theory, but as a practice, and that demanding a positive standard from a practice of resistance to systematization is precisely the demand that negative dialectics is designed to refuse. This response is either a genuine philosophical position or a strategic evasion, depending on how seriously you take the self-reference problem, and the debate has not been resolved. Part 24. The Live Objections, where the debate actually stands. The current state of Hegel scholarship is not one of convergence toward consensus. The major interpretive divisions have deepened rather than resolved, and new objections have emerged that cut across the existing fault lines. What follows is a map of the genuinely unsettled terrain, with the objections that even defenders of Hegel find hardest to answer identified precisely. The metaphysical versus normative dispute is the central ongoing debate, and its terms have evolved significantly. The crude form of the dispute, whether Hegel is a pre-Kantian dogmatic metaphysician or a sophisticated post-Kantian anti-metaphysician, has been superseded. Both Pippin and Houlgate now acknowledge that Hegel has a metaphysics. The question is, what kind? Pippin in 2119 characterizes it as metaphysics in a new sense, where logic and ontology are identical not in the sense that thought creates being, but in the sense that intelligibility and being are inseparable. Houlgate argues that this still underpays Hegel's commitment to a logic that is ontology directly, not merely a theory of the conditions of intelligibility. The precise specification of how the categories of pure thought can be simultaneously the structure of being without collapsing into pre-Kantian dogmatism or deflating into Kantian epistemology remains the hardest technical question in current Hegel studies. The problem of transition necessity is the second major live objection. Even readers sympathetic to the overall system have not been satisfied by the demonstration that each dialectical transition is strictly necessary rather than merely motivated or plausible. Rosen's 1982 critique that determinate negation does not generate a unique successor has never been fully answered. The transitions in the logic, the phenomenology, and the philosophy of right are widely acknowledged to be uneven. Some are compelling, some seem to require supplementary premises that are not drawn from the immanent logic of the preceding concept. Paul Redding's work and Graham Priest's logical formalization projects have both tried to tighten the account of transitions with limited success. The problem of transition necessity may be the most practically significant objection for anyone who wants to use the dialectic as a method outside of Hegel's own texts. The Eurocentrism and racism of Hegel's philosophy of history constitute a third objection that is neither purely political nor irrelevant to the philosophical core. Hegel's account of which peoples and cultures have contributed to the development of freedom consciousness in history systematically excludes Africa and pre-Columbian America from world history on grounds that are not merely ignorant, but structurally motivated by the progressive teleology of the system. The teleological framework requires stages, and the stages are populated with actual historical cultures assigned ranks by a philosopher who knew remarkably little about most of them. Recent scholarship by Teshele Tibebu, Peter Park, and in a different register, Robert Bernasconi has argued that this is not an accidental bias that can be removed by updating the historical information, but a structural consequence of the teleological framework itself. If the framework requires that historical cultures be assigned places on a developmental hierarchy, then any philosopher who uses it will produce a hierarchy that reflects the prejudices of her historical location. Whether a reconstructed Hegelian philosophy of history can abandon the developmental hierarchy while retaining the immanent critical method is one of the most contested questions in contemporary Hegel scholarship. The question of whether Hegel's system is genuinely open or covertly closed is the fourth live debate. Hegel insists that philosophy comprehends its own historical moment rather than projecting beyond it, that the owl of Minerva cannot prescribe the future. But the system's claim to comprehensiveness, to being the circle of circles that contains all the fundamental categories of rational thought, implies that future developments can only be applications or elaborations of structures already derived. This is the open-closure problem that several recent commentators, including the 2014 paper by Kirsty Gjersdal, have pursued. If the logic's categories are derived necessarily and exhaustively, then no genuinely new logical category is possible, which means history can bring new content but not new rational structure. But if new rational structure is possible, then the logic's claim to exhaustive derivation is false. The tension between systematicity and genuine historical openness has not been resolved in the literature, and the recent engagement between Hegel scholarship and philosophy of science, particularly around whether Hegel's logical categories can accommodate the formal structures of contemporary mathematical physics, has made the problem more acute rather than less. The ultimate question that runs beneath all of these disputes is whether Hegel's project of philosophy as the system of all rational categories, comprehending its own historical location and the structure of its own method, is a coherent aspiration or a self-defeating one. Kant drew limits on what reason can know. Hegel argued that drawing limits is itself a rational act that exceeds the limits. The question is whether that argument succeeds, or whether it is, as some critics have maintained since Schopenhauer, simply the refusal to acknowledge that limits exist, combined with the production of enormously elaborate prose that simulates the transcendence of limits without achieving it. That question is not yet settled, and the rigour and seriousness with which it continues to be pursued in current journals and monographs is the best evidence that Hegel remains a living problem rather than a solved one.